everyone to our UHN Caregiver Talks. Today is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Jill Goldman. Jill Goldman is a professor of genetic counseling in neurology at the Columbia University Medical Center. She has specialized in hereditary neurological diseases such as FTD, prion disease, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and Huntington's disease. She is on the faculty of the Columbia University Master's Program in Genetic Counseling. Additionally, she leads a support group for caregivers of people with frontotemporal dementia. She's also created and coordinates A Friend for Rachel, which is a companionship program in which people with early to moderate dementia are paired with Columbia pre-medical students. Ms. Goldman has authored many papers and book chapters, including Genetic Counseling and Testing for Alzheimer's Disease, Joint Practice Guidelines of the American College of Medical Genetics, and the National Society of Genetic Counselors. So please join me in welcoming Jill, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the information you have to share.
Thank you very much. I am so pleased to be here. This is a subject that really crosses borders, and certainly in this trying time, I think it's really important to share resources and get to know each other. So I am just delighted to be here, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see that okay? All right, terrific. Okay, so today we're going to do a bunch of things. We're going to look at family histories and try to figure out which kind of family histories are appropriate for genetic testing. To think about when you would consider genetic testing and what you have to think about in order to go forward. I'm going to go into two different dementias, Alzheimer's disease and frontotemporal dementia, and talk to you about the genetics of both of them. Talk to you about the whole process of genetic counseling and testing, and the psychosocial issues that are involved are, quite important to think about. We'll talk a little bit about direct-to-consumer testing, and then, what to do if someone turns out to carry a genetic etiology for the disease. Okay, so first of all, we were talking about this a little bit before everybody got on, but when would you even consider genetic testing for somebody with dementia? And this is changing a little bit, and I'll try to explain that. But in general, if there is a significant family history of that particular disease, if someone has an early onset, meaning usually before the age of 65, if we know that the particular symptoms are associated with a genetic disease, more and more doctors are ordering genetic testing when there is a family history, but they're not actually sure of the diagnosis. And sometimes they'll order genetic testing with hopes of finding a particular genetic cause which can give the diagnosis. As we know, there are more clinical trials, and sometimes these clinical trials are for particular genes or people who carry particular genes, and then you would need to do genetic testing. And then most recently, there are now two medications that slow down Alzheimer's disease, and people with a certain genetic makeup are more likely to have side effects from the medication. So that's another thing that we would test for, and I'll talk about that more later. Okay. All right. So then if somebody does have a family history, who would be appropriate for testing? Certainly the person with the condition, as long as they are over 18, at least in the US, we do not test people under 18, and that's pretty much standard around the world. We want people to have genetic counseling prior to testing so they really understand what they're getting into, what are the benefits of testing, what are the risks of testing, and also there are limitations and they need to understand that. And it is really not appropriate for someone to undergo genetic testing if they themselves are not psychologically stable and don't have support. So we want, and here I'm really talking much more about predictive testing to determine that you carry a gene and you will get the disease in the future. So it's a lot to live with to know that you carry a gene, and we want people to be stable. Okay. So if you're thinking about testing, what do you have to ask yourself? And, these are pretty heavy questions. And this is really what goes on in genetic counseling. But I like to have people really think about these before they come to genetic counseling. So if I knew my genetic status, is there anything I can do to prevent the disease or slow down the disease? What would learning this information do to my life? Would it be helpful? Could I get things ready? Or would it be harmful? Would I think about this all the time and not really enjoy my life? If that's the case, we would not encourage genetic testing. Really important to think about the family, who you would share results with, and how it would affect the family. Okay, so that was all about testing. When is genetic counseling appropriate? And the answer is anytime people are worried about either their family history or things that they might be susceptible to a genetic disease. And going for genetic counseling does not mean you have to follow through with genetic testing. So, if anybody is ever interested, they can either contact the clinic that they're working with to find out if they have genetic counselors, or in your cases, to contact the Canadian Association of Genetic Counselors. Okay, so let's talk about Alzheimer's disease first. As I said, this is not unique to any country. There are 7 million people in the US who have Alzheimer's disease. Most of those people have what we call late onset Alzheimer's disease, but there's about 200,000 people who get it before the age of 65, and this is considered early onset Alzheimer's. In Canada, there are about 780,000 people right now with Alzheimer's disease, so a significant number of those, and this is true around the world. About 2/3 are women. We know that women live longer than men, and so that's part of why they get more Alzheimer's. But we also know that women at every age are more inclined to get Alzheimer's. So there's other things, maybe hormonal things going on. Now, of all these people, only about 1% have strictly genetic forms of Alzheimer's disease, and these are called dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease. Okay. So it's really important to remember that Alzheimer's is only one of many, many dementias. And dementia is what we think of as an umbrella term. So Alzheimer's is certainly the most common by far, but you have vascular dementia, you have Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia, and many others. And sometimes we find that people have what's called a mixed dementia. So it might be Alzheimer's disease with some Lewy body or with some vascular dementia. So I said it's important to look at family histories. Most people have family histories that look like this, where one person in the family is affected. This could be any dementia. Right now, I'm talking about Alzheimer's disease. And this could be at any age. If we tested this person, even though they are under the age of 65, it would be unusual to find a genetic mutation, or we now call them pathogenic variants. But it is possible. And it's possible because either there's lost family history or there is misattributed parentage. Perhaps the father isn't really the father, or there was an undisclosed adoption. So lots of different reasons that we actually could find a mutation, but it would be unusual. Then we go to the other extreme. Whoops, sorry. Just trying to move this. Okay, so this, which I'm calling autosomal dominant, and I will explain that term, is very different. Here you're seeing that there is an affected person in every generation. They all are young. So when it's crossed out here, that means the person has died. So if they died at 68 and to say they had the disease for 15 years, they were quite young when they developed symptoms. So everybody is a first-degree relative of somebody else who is affected. Okay. And in this kind of inheritance, you only need to inherit one gene to have the disease. So we would be able to find mutation in this kind of family. This is sort of a mixture. So what you're seeing here is that there are more cases than you would expect in the family. So there seems to be something familial, something genetic. But if you look, this person would have had to inherit a gene from the father here, but the father didn't have the disease. So this is when you think about skipping generations. That's not really a genetic term, but that's what people say. In fact, what it is something called penetrance, meaning how often do you get the disease if you carry the gene? And these kinds of genes that cause the familial type of family history are really risk genes. They don't cause the disease, they increase your risk. So you can actually carry the gene and never get the disease. Okay, so Alzheimer's disease is very heritable, meaning you have a combination of the familial type and the 1% of the autosomal dominant type. But only about 30% of this heritability is due to known genes. So there's lots out there that we don't know. And most of what we don't know are the risk genes. just having a first-degree relative with Alzheimer's, or in fact, any of these dementias, will increase your lifetime risk about 2 to 3 times. But this is really true. This is empiric risk. This is really true of any disease. So if your parents had heart disease or arthritis or diabetes, you'd be at greater risk for those too. The really strong risk is this 1% here. Okay, so I talked about the importance of thinking about family, and this is one of the things I think is most critical when you're thinking about genetic testing. I've had too many horror stories with patients who really didn't talk to their families. And this is hard. Sometimes people don't like to raise anxiety in their families, before it's necessary. Or sometimes people don't want to hear things. But if at all possible, I think you need to find out as much as you can about your family history. And then if you are considering genetic testing, talk to family ahead of time and find out how much they really want to know. They have a right not to know, but it's easier to have this discussion before you test than when you have the little piece of paper in your hand. So, lots of people have misconceptions about genetic testing and about dementia in their family. Um, and one of those misconceptions is that it always looks identical to, say, what your father had. And that's not necessarily true. Everybody is a whole mixture of genes. You're half your mom and half your dad. And you're not going to be identical to your family member, even if you got the same disease. Also, lots of family histories might have different types of dementia in them or different types of neurological conditions. And sometimes, particularly in the past, some of those diagnoses might be wrong. So it's sort of important to ask lots of questions and find out as much as you can, not about how the person was at the very end of their life, but how they were when they started with their symptoms. Were they forgetful? Did they start doing things they never did before? Did they have trouble with word finding? So questions like that, so you can really better understand and tell the doctor a better family history. Oops. Okay, so going back to that term autosomal dominant, because all the diseases that I'm going to talk about are autosomal dominant diseases. So what that means is that the dominant means that you only have to have one copy of the disease gene to get the disease. Now, going back to high school biology, everybody should remember that we are half our mom and half our dad because we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, half from mom and half from dad. You have 2 copies of every gene in every cell in your body. So here, this person, this parent, has a pathogenic variant or a mutation, same thing, and they have a normal gene, but they have symptoms of whatever this disease is. Let's call it Alzheimer's. This parent has 2 normal genes. Every time they have children, this parent has to pass on a normal gene to the children. This parent has a 50% chance of passing on the normal gene and a 50% chance of passing on the disease gene. If you inherit the disease gene, you will most likely get the disease. And then the other thing that's important to realize is if you have 4 children, they could all have the disease gene, they could all have the extra normal gene, or it could be a mix. So there's a 50% risk for each child. Okay, so when we're doing genetic testing, we are actually looking at the sequence of these compounds, G, A, T, and C, along the DNA. So what you're seeing here is that in each cell, there are these chromosomes. Here is a chromosome. And the chromosome, in turn, is made of the DNA. And there are many genes along each chromosome, and the sequence of these letters within the gene actually give instructions for making a protein. So a mutation or a pathogenic variant is a change in that DNA. All right, so the DNA code that's coding for this protein is a 3-letter code. And you can see that if I change cat to CCT, that's got a different meaning. It's sort of like reading a book, and each word is a 3-letter word. So CCT is got a different meaning than CAT. So that's one type of mutation. And you can see the same thing here in English. Here, they've changed the G in dog to a T in dot, different meaning. Here, they've taken out a letter. Here, they've put in extra letters. So these are all different types of mutations or pathogenic variants. So if we are going to talk about the autosomal dominant 1% of very genetic Alzheimer's disease, there are 3 different genes that we're concerned with. The amyloid precursor protein gene, or APP, the presenilin 1 gene, and the presenilin 2 genes. These are all autosomal dominant. And then I talked about risk genes. Well, the most important risk gene for Alzheimer's is something called ApoE, and the variety is ApoE4. Okay. So, what do you have to think about again when you're bringing somebody for genetic testing? Who's going to make the decision, and what should you think about? First of all, there needs to be a good workup for whatever disease is progressing in the patient. And genetic testing is one of the last tests that you would do because you want to know what you're testing for. Then you have to think about who's asking for this genetic testing: the patient themselves, family members, or is it the doctor who wants to know? In the case of testing someone with dementia, you need to think about whether that person, prior to their dementia, would have wanted this genetic testing, or is this coercion from somebody else? So this is really an ethical issue about genetic testing. So again, it's nice to talk to the family. Certainly if a spouse or relative has beginning of Alzheimer's disease, but could still participate in decisions, this would be one of the things that you might talk about. And as I said before, it's also important to know who you're going to share the results with and whether they want to know. Okay, so just a quick family history to show you how complicated things can be. So this was a 60-year woman with a 6-year history of memory loss. So she started when she was about 54. And she came to clinic with both her adult daughter, who really wanted to have her mom tested because her grandmother also had early onset Alzheimer's disease. And she wanted to know her own risk for reproductive reasons. But her twin sister really didn't want to know. And she knew that if her sister carried the gene, then in fact, she carried the gene too. So, we often find that families aren't on the same track. And, this really needed to be worked out before we went ahead. As it turned out, the sister realized that if she carried the gene, she was going to get the disease and she was going to get it very soon. So she gave in and thought it was more important for her niece to get the information. And the mom was very conflicted because she didn't want to choose. So, this is why you really need to think about family, ahead of going for testing. Okay, so if I had a patient who, was appropriate for testing, what would I order? So you're seeing here a whole bunch of different genes, and unless we actually know a particular mutation in the family, so say I have a patient and the brother of that patient already had genetic testing, and from his genetic testing, we know a particular mutation to test. That is one of the few times that we would only order a single gene test. Usually nowadays, we're ordering panels. And that really is to cover our bases because diagnoses aren't always right. Even when we can do biomarkers, such as the spinal tap or an amyloid scan that might indicate Alzheimer's, but just to cover bases, we tend to do these panels. So you're seeing here the Alzheimer's genes, the frontotemporal dementia genes, a different dementia, prion disease, and I will explain this later, but many of the frontotemporal dementia genes also can cause Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. So that's on the panel as well. Okay, now you can get 3 different results from genetic testing. You can get a positive result, meaning they found a change in the DNA that has been associated with the disease that the person has been diagnosed with. A negative means that there's no known genetic findings. So the disease, it doesn't change diagnosis at all, but it says that the person does not carry a genetic form of this disease for the genes that we can now test for. There might be new genes in the future. And then unfortunately, there's a third result, which can be really frustrating to people. And that's something known, called a result of unknown significance. And what that means is that a variant was found, but we don't know enough about that variant to be able to call it disease-causing or benign. And when that happens, and especially with panels, it can happen a lot. You can even get several of these VUSs, and we can't do anything with them. You can't assume that they're positive, and you can't assume they're negative. So what happens is that you hold on to the information, and in a year or two, you call the lab and you say, do you have any more information about this variant? And labs will try to go back when they have more data, and labs share data, and they try to reclassify these VUSs so that they can give, the patients answers. Most of the time, they classify them or reclassify them as benign, not disease causing, but every once in a while it goes the other way. Okay, and when you get a test result, it looks like something like this. So it's telling you where in the DNA the change is, what the change is, where in the protein there's a change, and what the change is in the protein. Okay, so this is from a study called the Diane study, which is the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network. This is an international study. And in this study, they take people who have a family history of a known pathological or pathogenic variant in one of the Alzheimer's genes. And they watch family members from many years before, excuse me, before they would get symptoms to when they actually develop symptoms. So you can see that the disease actually starts long before you see a clinical change. Okay. And this can be as long as 15 years before for some of these biomarkers. So you're seeing changes in the MRI, you're seeing changes in proteins in the cerebral spinal fluid, in the PET scan, and then neuropsych testing. Okay. So, those studies are being performed so that, when there is a medication that could stop the disease, it's given early enough. Okay, so let's shift for a minute from testing the person with the disease to doing predictive testing. And that again means the child of someone with excuse me, hereditary Alzheimer's disease might want to get genetic testing to determine whether they're going to get it in the future. So why would somebody want to do this? I would say the great majority of my patients who do predictive testing are somewhere between 25 and 40, and they're trying to make life decisions, particularly reproductive decisions. So if somebody knows that they carry a gene, say for Alzheimer's, they could choose not to have children. They could choose to go ahead and have kids the old-fashioned way because before that child would ever develop Alzheimer's disease, there might be, some scientific finding. I mean, we're talking 50, 60 years in the future. They might choose to adopt. They might use a gamete donation, or they might do something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And I'm going to explain that later, but basically they're using IVF to produce embryos, and then they test the embryos for the gene in the family. Other reasons for doing predictive testing is being able to plan out your life better. So, people say, well, if I knew I carried the gene, I'd retire earlier. I would travel more. I wouldn't go back to school and waste time and money if I couldn't practice for a long time. Okay, so that's certainly are good reasons. A lot of people just can't deal with uncertainty, and they feel that they would be they would be better off knowing than thinking about it all the time and just wondering. And then the last reason, which I mentioned before, would be clinical trial candidacy for those trials where you need to know your genetic status. Lots of reasons why people choose not to have genetic testing. And the literature basically says that of all the people who are at risk, at 50% risk for one of these diseases, for Alzheimer's, for Huntington's, for FTD, only about 20% go on and get tested. So it certainly isn't something that you have to do. You just need to think about it a lot. So some people feel that they're not psychologically stable, that it wouldn't be good for them. They're perfectly happy with their life and don't want to change it. They're worried that they might feel guilty because other people in their family might carry the gene and they might not. It sounds backwards, but people do feel that way. They don't want to test unless there's prevention. They don't want to have to tell their family members. They don't want to be discriminated against. And they don't want to have to make reproductive decisions. They just want to have children the way they plan to. Okay, so in the US, and I believe in Canada, there are laws that protect against discrimination for either reasons of family history or for your own genetic information. In the US, these protect for health insurance and for employment, but do not cover life insurance, disability, or long-term care. So we often suggest that people get the insurance that they want prior to genetic testing. With the state of things in the US right now, I have no idea what's going to happen to this law, which is driving me crazy. Anyway, okay, so here is the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis process. Again, you use IVF. You fertilize the egg, you produce an embryo, you wait about 5 days and you get a ball of cells, and they remove a few cells, which doesn't hurt the embryo. And then you test those cells for the known mutation. And then you would transfer only those embryos that don't carry that mutation. So it's really an incredible process for people who need to use it. Doesn't always work. And IVF can be very expensive. So that's, something you have to think about. And you might need to go through several IVF courses. And even then, it may not work because either there aren't enough embryos or there's something else wrong with the embryos. It's not just the gene you're looking at. There could be other chromosomal problems with the embryos, or it might not implant, but it could be a wonderful thing. Okay, I'm already running out of time and I'm nowhere here. Okay, so I just quickly to go over the kinds of questions that I ask during genetic counseling. I ask people to bring a support person with them. Then I talk about, how would you react to a positive test over the short term? How would it affect you over the long term? Can you adapt to a positive test knowing you carry the gene? But also, could you adapt to a negative test? What if your sister tested and she was positive? Would you feel terribly guilty if you were negative? Okay. Again, who are you going to tell about your results? Do they want to know? Should you talk to them before? How is it going to affect your partner or other family members? And do you have enough support? You know, do you have people you can talk to about this? And should there be a therapist involved in your decision? I also talked to the support person that's come to ask them how they think the persons who's being asked to test would respond, and also how they, the support person, would respond to the results. And sometimes you get different answers between um, a partner and their loved one. And when you do, it's time to try to involve somebody else who could meet with these folks and really work out whether testing is the thing to do. Okay. Also have to think about privacy. You know, where are these results going to go? Is it going to go into electronic medical records? Will that have any influence on, insurance? Will it have any influence on anything else? um, and yeah, yeah, and so all of those things need to be thought about before. So these are, quotes from people. The second one is from Alice Wexler, who is the sister of Nancy Wexler, who helped to find the Huntington's gene. And I think it's a beautiful statement. Choosing not to take the test is a decision that one could easily revoke, unlike the situation after testing. Once you have the information, you cannot give it back. So, again, my point is that anybody who is considering genetic testing, particularly predictive testing, should really spend a lot of time thinking about don't jump. Okay. I'm going to skip over this story, but basically that young man went and did 23andMe. And found that he carried 2 copies of the risk gene I talked about, the ApoE gene, but also sent his for his raw data. 23andMe, which is now going bankrupt, sends their regular testing to approved laboratories, but not their raw data. So you can actually get a printout of all your genetic information, but that's not verified in an approved lab. And what this young man found was that he carried a presenilin 1 mutation, one of those autosomal dominant genes. Problem was both of his parents were in their 60s and were fine. And he knew if he carried this gene, one of them had to carry it too. So he sent a second sample to Ancestry.com, which said he didn't carry it. I finally convinced him to get clinical testing, and in fact, he didn't carry it. And what that shows is that these direct-to-consumer companies aren't all that they say they are. And there have been studies proving that about 40% of the information from the raw data is incorrect. So don't do that. Okay, just quickly on the ApoE gene. ApoE comes in 3 flavors, so to speak, ApoE 2, 3, and 4, and you've got 2 copies. So you could be 2-2, 2-3, 2-4, 3-3, 3-4, 4-4. We know that ApoE4 is a risk gene for Alzheimer's. It's also a risk gene for cardiovascular disease. In the general public, the distribution of these genes is about like so. The ApoE2 actually decreases risk. So you can see in the Alzheimer's clinic, if I tested people there, the number of people with ApoE4 goes up, so it's associated with risk, but more than 60% of people still have Alzheimer's and don't have ApoE4. So it's not necessary to get the disease. And a lot of these people aren't going to go on and get Alzheimer's disease. So it's not sufficient for having these disease. So up until now, we have not encouraged people to get ApoE testing. 23andMe does it. Other companies out there do it. But you're finding out that you have particularly one copy of the gene just says, yeah, you're at slightly increased risk. Finding out that you have two copies increases that risk even more. So you can see that here, but it's still not anywhere near 100%. So it's just not going to tell you an awful lot. And the other thing to realize is that the risk actually differs by ethnicity, with whites having a much greater risk from ApoE than Blacks and Hispanics. Okay, the one time now that we are doing ApoE testing is when people are interested in taking Leqembi or the newer form of the similar drug, because people who are ApoE44 have a greater chance of getting what's called ARIA, which are amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. There can be brain bleeds and like little strokes, swelling. So for anybody interested in that, they do ApoE testing. All right. Okay, so the overall situation here with the genetics of Alzheimer's disease is you've got three very high risk genes. Those are your autosomal dominant genes. Down here, your risk would be sort of in the medium area if you had two copies of ApoE4, a little less than that with one copy. And then there's a whole bunch of other risk genes, more than I have here, each of which contribute a tiny little bit of risk. And so you really need to look at the overall risk by looking at all of those genes. That's being done in research, but not really clinically at this point. And that still wouldn't tell you the whole story, because there are environmental causes that we really don't understand. So Alzheimer's disease, except for the early onset autosomal dominant disease, is what we call multifactorial, partly genetic, partly environmental. We know things like head trauma increase the risk of Alzheimer's. Okay, just really quickly to give you a picture of the second dementia. This is frontotemporal dementia. You can see that it affects different parts of the brain than Alzheimer's disease. It is the second most common pre-senile dementia, meaning before the age of 65. And FTD is often misdiagnosed, sometimes as Alzheimer's disease, sometimes as a psychiatric disease, because the presentation is different. FTD usually presents as a behavioral change, where people develop very poor executive dysfunction or executive function. They have poor judgment. They do things they never would have done before. some people get involved with the law because they steal or they go up to people and touch or things like that. They lose insight very quickly, so they don't understand that there's anything wrong with them. Tendency to become disinterested in their normal interests, sometimes their family, sometimes work, sometimes social activities. There's what we call emotional blunting, meaning that they don't react the way that you would think that they should react. That can be really, really hard on young families. And many people with this disease develop what we call hyperorality, where they just can't turn off their appetite and can gain huge amounts of weight, tend to hoard food, tend to eat lots and lots of sweets. Anyway, not everybody with FTD have all of these, but these are some of the symptoms. They can also develop memory problems, but usually memory is relatively preserved early in the disease, not late in the disease. But this is where I said important to ask questions of your family about what the person with dementia was like early in the disease. The second way it can present is as a language impairment. And there are two of them, something called non-fluent primary progressive aphasia, where people lose language over time. Second, semantic variant or semantic dementia, where people continue to speak, but their language stops meaning anything and they have a hard time understanding language. So they lose the meaning of language. So those are the two types of FTD. Totally different genes. And again, this is why we do a panel to pick up some of these genes. So the three main genes are something called MAPT, or the tau gene, the progranulin or granulin gene, and a very weird gene called C9orf72, which can also cause ALS. And these are the rare genes, most of which can also cause ALS. I'm not going to go into this right now. But the overall situation with FTD is about 30% of FTD is genetic, 70% isn't. And you've got all these different genes, and many of them, as I said, can cause ALS. So we now see ALS and FTD on a disease spectrum, which is really very new and different and interesting. Okay, so I'm going to wind up with this. What do you do if you do have genetic testing and someone is positive? Really important to get support. There are support groups out there for people who have tested positive to any one of these diseases. I certainly encourage people to get therapy, to work with a therapist to help them come to terms with this and figure out their life. Remember that the reason you've done genetic testing is to take more control over your life, and now you have an opportunity for that. And you certainly can enroll in clinical trials, but don't just seek out, bizarre treatments. There is no evidence that any supplement or, apricot pits or anything like that helps with any of these diseases. And to spend money on that rather than enjoying life is not the way to go. So I've just put down three different studies to consider the Diana study I mentioned. Diane 2 is their trials unit of the Diana study. And for FTD, there is a US study called All FTD. I believe there are Canadian sites, and there's also a European study called GenFi that does take people with the disease, but also family members. Okay, so that was a huge amount of information. I left 4 minutes for questions. I'm sorry. I can stay on if anybody else can. But thank you for listening to all that.